Okay, we're live now, I think, and I'm going to go to share.
I need answers.
What kind of questions were they?
They were kind of, it was kind of questions when you're like, you know about forces like on the show.
Yeah.
Is this
Okay, we'll make a start. Welcome to session 3. So today we're talking about self-consciousness. What I'm going to try and do at the start of each session is to explain the point of the section in one sentence. The point of the last section was that if you try to develop an absolutely objective knowledge of the world without any reference to a subject, you're inevitably going to find the subject is involved. That you can't have an understanding of the object without the subject. The argument of this section is that you can't have an idea of the subject without other subjects. So if the end of the first section is like, okay, I can't have an objective knowledge without the subject. So this section now, well, what's the subject then? We're going to focus on what this self-consciousness is. And now this self-consciousness is going to try to, be just this subject. And what it's going to find is it cannot know what it is. It cannot determine itself without other subjects. That's the argument. And you may want to, look, I find this argument really counterintuitive. Again, I find it goes completely against. Last week, I remember I said I find this section on consciousness does actually go against the way in which I guess I'd call our dominant culture tends to view objective reality. This whole section, for me, goes against the way our dominant culture tends to, valorize the idea that who you are is really up to you. That if you want to have an idea of who you are, you've just got to close your eyes, look inside, and find that true you that's hidden there. The true you under the masks that you put on when you interact with the world. That there's a truth to who you are that persists through time, and that you don't need other people to tell you who you are. In fact, relying on other people to tell you who you are, this is according to the common sensibility, is almost like a surefire way to reach some sort of inauthenticity. So if I was going to say what's the dominant common sense cultural approach that Hegel's really criticizing in this section, it's the idea that you could develop a determinate sense of identity just by somehow taking yourself out of your historical, social, cultural context, or not context, but just your relation with other subjects. Now, this section does have there's 3 sections. I'm going to go through them in order as usual. The truth of self-certainty, lordship and bondage, and freedom of self-consciousness. Okay, first section. I'll say, another point. There's been a real swing of the pendulum. So the first section, section in consciousness, it's all about this objective world, this world that exists independently of the subject. At the start of this section, it's like, no. What's in the world is only relative to the self-consciousness. If it doesn't relate to the self-consciousness isn't interested. So there's a real move away from, you're right, you do need the subject to understand the object. But now it's like the pendulum shifts to, it's almost like the object only has meaning in relation to a subject, which is sort of how this section begins. Okay, the truth of self-certainty. You may just want to ask, what is the truth of self-certainty? And the one thing that you'll think of is like, we all know, Descartes, cogito ergo sum. It's I think, therefore I am. Can you doubt that you exist? Definitely not. I am self-certain that I exist. In fact, you can be more certain that you exist than that anyone else exists. Everyone else, has everyone heard this argument? It's often used in philosophy of mind, that everyone else is just a zombie. Because all you can really see is what's on the surface, the way that people behave. And all those things can just be programmed. Perhaps there is no inner life in other human beings. All that exists Everyone else is a zombie, and you're the only one with a rich inner life, with actually having some sort of phenomenological experience with the world. So that seems to be the truth of self-certainty. I can know my experiences, but I'll never know your experiences, right? You can also be self-certain in another way. This idea that only you know what you really desire, who you really are, what you want to be. The truth of self-certainty, as in a way, means that there's something inevitable about us being misunderstood, because there's a part of me that only I have access to, right? Now, Hegel's basic argument here in this section is that that whole idea of privileging a self-certainty as being able to contain the truth as to who you are, that is wrong. That's how I put it. You cannot know yourself without a connection with others. Without intersubjectivity, you actually don't have a determinate identity. And why that's the case, I find this argument fascinating. Like it's a counterintuitive point to make, and it's one that I almost feel like all my philosophical training has taught me not to think. Not in the sense that philosophers have claimed that, but in the sense that the reason you're drawn to philosophy in the first place is because I'm not like everyone else. I'm going to be an independent thinker. And so that philosophy really, the romance of philosophy is caught up with this ideal of the individual alone in their cave, pondering the world. Only they can see the truth. And so the idea that, in fact, no, all that time you spent in your room as a teenager, defying the world, seeking out the inner truth by separating yourself from everyone, that's actually wrong. That's not how you actually can't have a self-identity unless you have other consciousnesses. And when you accept this, like this is what I found, when you begin to think this way, all of a sudden, the way in which I think it just necessarily means the way you view freedom has to change. Because your whole idea of freedom is no longer going to be caught up with, I need to assert who I am in the world. I need other people to recognize who I am in the world. It's going to be caught up with, how do we organize the world collaboratively and together to maximize freedom? Freedom has to become a community. It has to be an intersubjective project if it's going to have meaning at all. So, so this section, that argument, I think, is probably the most important argument. I find it the most interesting as well, although there's others. So let's move on. Okay, so what is self-consciousness? So Hegel begins this section by sort of defining self-consciousness. Now, self-consciousness has these, if you just think about self-consciousness, you can sort of see these two moments of self-consciousness. It's, on one hand, self-consciousness is a unity, and on the other hand, it's something like a movement. So if I'm self-conscious, I'm not just aware of the world around me, although I have to be, there'll be something I'm aware of. But then there also has to be my awareness of that. That there's another part of me that isn't that awareness, which is in a sense able to take that awareness and unify it, step outside of it and say, this is an awareness, but it's an awareness for me. It's an awareness for a subject. And that, of course, is expressed in the famous tautology, I am I, which is sort of the post-Kantian Fichte, based his whole philosophy, like also the foundation for his whole philosophy, that Hegel's referring to here. And that structure of self-consciousness is really caught in that tautology that I am I, where you could read it as the first I is some sort of unity, and the second I is that object for itself. So the first is the structure of consciousness that's unifying everything, and the second is what's that consciousness aware of. I mean, this is why we can say things like, I don't feel like myself today, which is on the surface, it looks nonsensical. But the reason we can say things like that is because we take the first I to mean that the unifying thing, and that second I to be some idea of self, which self-consciousness is always stepping outside of. Okay. So self-consciousness in this sense is always taking the object and what it perceives and making it its own. Self-consciousness is this action of, I take the manifold appearance of things And then I say, but the way in which they're now appearing to me is relating to this unity that I have, so that they become, the world of objects becomes relative to this subject. And Hegel's name for that is desire. So self-consciousness is these two movements after that. Why? And this is, if we read this section here, it's so sudden. No, this is the section. So we'll read it out first. Consciousness as self-consciousness henceforth has a double object. So one is the immediate object out of sense certainty and perception, which, however, for self-consciousness has the character of a negative. In other words, there's the things I perceive, but insofar as it's self-consciousness, I'm always aware of the fact that the world is other than myself. It's not me. I'm something other than the world. I'm this thing that's unifying that into, so that it's just for me. And the second is itself, which is the true essence and is present in the first instance only as opposed to the first object. So in this sphere, self-consciousness exhibits itself as the movement in which this antithesis is removed and the identity of itself with itself becomes explicit for it. So I have an identity that I understand or relate to myself through the way in which I alienate myself from the world of objects. So why does that mean that self-consciousness is desire? So in the next section here. So this is the section, we'll read it out, and then I'll try to explain why self-consciousness is desire, at least as in terms of how I interpret it. So our self-consciousness, it is movement, but since what it distinguishes from itself is only itself as itself, the difference as an otherness is immediately superseded for it. The difference is not, and it, self-consciousness, is only the motionless tautology of I am I. But since for it the difference does not have the form of being, it is not for self-consciousness. Hence, otherness is for it in the form of a being or as a distinct moment, but there is also for consciousness the unity of itself with this difference as a second distinct moment. So you can see then the two moments he's separating out. One is just that perception of the world, and the second is this distinct moment when it unifies itself and becomes aware of itself as separate from the world.
Sorry, which sections?
Thank you. So with that first moment, self-consciousness is in the form of consciousness, and the whole expanse of the sensuous world is preserved for it, but at the same time only is connected with the second moment, the unity of self-consciousness with itself. And hence the sensuous world is for it an enduring existence, which, however, is only appearance or a difference which in itself is no difference. This antithesis of its appearance and its truth has, however, for its essence only the truth. Viz. The unity of self-consciousness with itself. This unity must become essential to self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is desire in general. So the way that I read that is just that everything that is perceived in the world is unified by this self-consciousness. So the self-consciousness in a way takes the world that's alien to it, that's other than it, and by relating it to it is turning it into what the world is for it. And a name for that is desire, because desire is just, what do I want from the world? How can this world affirm me? How can these things have meaning relative to my projects and to what I am in the world? So self-consciousness is this thing that's going to then, in terms of desire, want everything in the world, or be this thing that turns the things into the world into something that is meaningful to it and what it is, as something that's separate from that world. So Hegel opposes this desire to something he calls life, and I have a definition there by John Stewart, which sort of explains this definition of life. And life is just Hegel's word for the totality of that objective world that self-consciousness is separating itself from. So this is Stewart's definition. So desire amounts to the individual's desire to preserve his own identity and individuality by negating other insubstantial objects and by reinterpreting the world by means of this criterion. So the world is appropriated in accordance with the needs and desires of the self-conscious subject in the pursuit of its self-identity. And the concept of life, the concept of life functions as an abstract category for the world of nature that self-consciousness makes use of. So life is just this totality of things in the world that self-consciousness is making use of as it affirms its desire in the world, as it makes that objective world relative to it. So in section 171, we have this idea of the separation of self-consciousness from life. So self-consciousness disowns its, sort of asserts itself by disowning its connection with life, by saying that it's something other than life. And we'll read through this together. So if we distinguish more exactly the moments contained here, we see that we have as the first moment the subsistence of the independent shapes, or the suppression of what diremption is in itself, that the shapes have no being in themselves, no enduring existence. The second moment, however, is a subjection of that existence to the infinity of the difference. In the first moment, there isn't the existent shape as being for itself or being in its determinateness infinite substance. It comes forward in antithesis to the universal substance, disowns this fluent continuity with it, and asserts that it is not dissolved in this universal element, but on the contrary preserves itself by separating itself from this, its inorganic nature, and by consuming it. Life in the universal fluid medium, a passive separating out of the shapes, becomes, just by doing so, a movement of those shapes, or becomes life as a process. The simple universal fluid medium is the in itself, and the difference of the shapes is the other. But this fluid medium itself becomes the other through this difference. For now it is for the difference which exists in and for itself, and consequently is a ceaseless movement by which this passive medium is consumed, life as a living thing. Now here, this is just so in this section, Hegel's sort of describing how in life there is a tendency for organisms to separate themselves out from this infinity of life and sort of become things that assert themselves as something separate from that life. They take on these existent shapes. And they, as he said there, they disown their fluent continuity with it and assert themselves as not being dissolved in the universal element. And the way they do that, of course, as it says there, is, but on the contrary, they preserve themselves by separating themselves out of that and actually start consuming it. So life in this universal fluid medium, this passive separating out, is almost like this, life itself becomes this process of things separating themselves out from that universal medium, but then, and then like, almost like, falling back into it again. Yeah, so that ceaseless movement by which the passive medium is consumed. The key thing here for self-consciousness, though, is that when you have this self-consciousness as a unity that comes to desire things, that desire is always going to involve, or almost like a destruction of objects. That it's not going to let the objects be what they are for themselves. Because when something separates itself out and becomes a separate organism from that infinite substance of life, it distinguishes itself. The way it separates itself out from that world is by taking it, eating it, by consuming it, by turning that into something that it wants and that it uses. So then you have this idea of self-consciousness that asserts its objective existence by basically destroying the independent object of life. So I'm a self-consciousness in the world, and I perceive an apple. But now that we've moved out of consciousness, the apple is going to no longer just appear as an object that's independent of me. It's going to appear as in like a field of desire. What is the apple for me? How does the apple relate to the way that I want to separate myself out from life? And of course, it relates to it, and that is something that I can eat. It's a food source. So then I go to the apple, and what do I do to the apple? When I desire it, I eat it, and now the apple's gone. So this project of desire, it isn't just sitting back and saying, oh, this is what I want, this is what I want. It's more this activity where you separate yourself from the world by actually just by not allowing any object just to be what it is for itself. The object only exists in relation to what it can, the way it can allow you to reinforce your identity and what you are. So the simple I here is this genus or the simple universal for which the differences are not differences, only by its being the negative essence of the shaped independent moments. And self-consciousness is certain of itself only by superseding this other that presents itself to self-consciousness as an independent life. So I can only assert that I am not this life by in some way reducing this life to objects that can be destroyed by me as I desire in the world, as I turn them into things that are relative to me. So certain of the nothingness of this other, it explicitly affirms that this nothingness is for it the truth of the other. It destroys the independent object and thereby gives itself the certainty of itself as a true certainty, a certainty which has become explicit for self-consciousness itself in an objective manner. So in destroying the apple, in taking it into my body, I sort of prove to myself that I'm the real thing, not the apple. The apple is just this, these objects really only have their existence insofar as they relate to what I'm doing in the world. Then in section, now this is the part which I find, so this is I think the most interesting part of the book for me, and I'm not sure I understand it, but he makes the argument here that only another self-consciousness can recognize a self-consciousness. Okay, and this is the crux of why he answers the question here as to why you can't have a determinate self-consciousness just defining itself. Now, so far, that would appear, the story we've heard so far, you sort of think, well, we do have this determinate self-consciousness defining itself, because it's going out in the world and it's changing things in the world to satisfy itself. It eats apples, it eats plants and animals and destroys them and takes it into its own body. It sees some trees and it cuts them down and makes a house. Like this self-consciousness is defining itself by the way it's having this objective, objective way in which it's shaping the world. So how can you get from that to the idea that no, those objects are not really defining the self-consciousness? Why not? Okay, so whereas consciousness relates to the world as a series of passive objects, self-consciousness relates to the world as a negativity in itself that affirms itself as something separate from the world. So that is rather than merely observing or perceiving the world, the self-consciousness seeks to create itself or mark itself as not the world. So self-consciousness is thus acting in the world to affirm its separateness and its independent negativity. So that all makes sense so far? Okay, next step. So objects in the world of life are unable to provide self-consciousness with satisfaction of its determinateness because when the self-consciousness bends these objects to its desire, it destroys them. So for self-consciousness to be recognized and to see its status as this negativity, as a thing that desires to achieve its unity, the only way it can achieve that recognition is to encounter something else in the world that doesn't bend to its will, that it can't just relate, that it can't just destroy or reduce to its desire. And what's this other thing in the world that can be that is also taken out of the world, that isn't reducible to just another object in the world, just a part of life? And that would be another self-consciousness. Yes. Now, a way that I'm thinking about this at the moment, I'm going to skip ahead quickly, is this. If you imagine a world where everyone just did what you wanted immediately, right? On the surface, it sounds fantastic. But in fact, it would be horrible, right? What do you miss when you have an existence where if you meet someone and you can just say, think like this, and they'll just think like that. Or if you can say, go get me some food, pay for my dinner, and everyone just did everything you told them to. If all your desires, in that respect, if everyone in your world was just reduced to an object that just did what you wanted to, you would suddenly find, Hegel's argument would be, I think, that you would suddenly find you no longer can have an identity. You're not going to know what you are anymore. Why not? Wouldn't you just be happy? Why not? The argument seems to be that I can only have legitimacy as this desiring being that's separated out from life. If I'm recognized, if that what I am is actually recognized by another self-consciousness, I can't recognize it on my own. Because if I don't have another self-consciousness, then all I have in the world are other objects, which are just going to be always relative to and reducible to what I want them to be, how I'm seeing the world. I'm never going to have that challenged. But another way you can think about it is, or that I've been thinking about it, is in this. So when you have a self-consciousness, recognize another self-consciousness, there's this mutual giving way that affirms both self-consciousnesses, right? I'm going to refer to a Henry short story that I wrote in the holidays. It's called The Gifts of the Magi. Okay, it's pretty straightforward though. So there's a young couple, they're married, they love each other, but they're poor. And the husband just got off to work, the wife's at home, and she's like, I really want to get my husband an amazing Christmas present. I want to give him the best Christmas present ever because I love him so much. But the only money I've managed to save all year is like $1 a bit. What I really want to get him is this silver chain that goes with his most precious object in the world, and that's a watch that was given to him by his grandfather. And I just know he'd love this silver chain, it would make him so happy. So I'm going to do something to get that money, and that is sell my hair. So she goes to a wig maker, they cut off all her hair, she gets the money, she goes out and buys this watch chain. She's a little bit worried about what her husband's going to think when he comes home, but nevertheless, she does what she does. And then, of course, the husband comes home, and he sees her appearance. He's like, "What have you done? You cut your hair." She's like, "Look, I know, but look, it'll grow back. That doesn't matter. What's important is I've got you an amazing gift." And she gives him the present, and he unwraps it, and he goes like this, "Oh my goodness." He's not happy at all. She's like, "What's wrong?" And he's like, "Well, remember how we know how I want you to be really happy. I saw that there was a set of brushes that you loved, which I'd never be able to afford. So I sold that watch to get the money to buy you this brush set." So both of them have, in a way, given up everything to give each other a gift that is now useless, because each has given up the thing that was most precious to them. Yeah. But the point of the story, and Henry makes it at the end, is that in that exchange of these gifts, where each has shown that they're willing to completely have their desires, in a way, their desire has become to affirm the desires of the other. In that exchange of, in a way, useless gifts, they've actually also incredibly affirmed in an incredible way their love for each other. And so it's, of course, the point of the story is that it strengthens their relationship. The very failure of the gifts proves the nature of their love. So in that relationship, in love, you have something like, I affirm your independence, your desire as a subject. But in affirming that, I get that same affirmation back through you. So both of us become affirmed. Both of us feel like I really am this being that has legitimate desires in the world, that who I'm going to be affirmed as a being that has I'm going to be affirmed as a being that has projects, that has almost like some autonomy in the world to want to do things in the world. And I know that I have because of how because of that intersubjective recognition, right? So that's the idea, and that's how I've made sense of these very confusing phrases in this section. In 175 and I think 176 as well. So self-consciousness wants to assert its true independence, its reality as desiring subjects. The objects, though, that it encounters in affirming its desire in life in general, it just destroys them in making them. They just become exactly what that self-consciousness wants them to be. So desire then must be striving for more than just self-consciousness. And I think what Hegel means there is that what it desires is to have its desire, its capacity to be other than life, recognized. But the only object that can do that is something that is subtracted from life, something other than life, and that is another self-consciousness. That's how I'm reading this section, so I'll read it out now. So in this satisfaction, however, experience makes it aware that the object has its own independence. Desire and the self-certainty obtained in this gratification are conditioned by the object. The self-certainty comes from superseding this other. In order that this supersession can take place, there must be this other. Thus, self-consciousness, by its negative relation to the object, is unable to supersede it. It is really because of that relation that it produces the object again, and the desire as well. And I mean, you get a sense there that in that first relationship of desire with the world, it really can never be done with just desiring more things and consuming more things. It never finds any sort of certainty in regarding its identity as a self-consciousness just from other objects in the world. So it is in fact something other than self-consciousness that is the essence of desire. And through this experience, self-consciousness has itself realized this truth. In other words, it's not just that I want to affirm myself. That's not what I really desire. What I desire is to have that recognized, and that what I am, that nature of myself, recognized. But at the same time, it is no less absolutely for itself, and it is so only by superseding the object, and it must experience its satisfaction, for it is the truth. On account of the independence of the object, therefore, it can achieve satisfaction only when the object itself affects the negation within itself. So only when the object itself that is desiring is also carries that negation within itself. It's also like a self-consciousness that isn't just another object in life. And it must carry out this negation of itself in itself, for it is in itself the negative, and must be for the other what it is. Since the object is in its own self-negation, and in being so is at the same time independent, it is consciousness. In the sphere of life, which is the object of desire, negation is present in an other, viz. In desire, or as a determinateness opposed to another in different form, or as the inorganic universal nature of life. But this universal independent nature in which negation is present as absolute negation is the genus as such, or the genus as self-consciousness. So self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. So you can see that last section there, it seems to separate out this. You can have desire, sorry. So in the sphere of life, you can either have the objects which in a way are other self-consciousnesses, which are where the negation is present in them. They're also in a way have been subtracted from life. Or there's just the object of desire for universal life. But the universal independent nature in which negation is present as absolute negation, that is just another self-consciousness. So in this earlier section, before he gets to the master-slave, Hegel has put forth his essential argument that you can only have, that a self-consciousness can only get some idea of its determinate identity by relating to another self-consciousness. This relates to like in early work in Hegel, he writes about love as being this unity of the subject and the object, this pure subject-object identity. So in love, the subject finds itself in the other as object, as the other finds itself in the self. So in the experience of love, subject and object, self and other, realize their natures through one another, and moreover, each of them recognizes itself only through the other. Now, when he gets to phenomenology of spirit, Hegel's replaced this idea of love with recognition. Love is like a type of recognition. The difference between recognition and love, though, is that here, the love he's talking about here is really the love of, like almost like an amorous love, and recognition is just a broader category. But but it has a similar structure, just insofar as in the act of recognition, I find myself outside of myself in how the other sees myself, and so that there's no longer an alienation between the two different self-consciousnesses. So I think that would work in terms of recognition as well. It's so in the same way that love is a process where you lose yourself, but you find yourself in that act of self-surrender, as an example of a short story I just shared. That self-surrendering is actually an act where you find what you really are, rather than an act of you lose everything that you are. Yes. And this is how I'm making sense of this section. So a self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness. Only so is it in fact self-consciousness. For only in this way does the unity of itself and its otherness become explicit for it. So the only way in which I can explicitly have it affirmed that my that my desire, my projects in the world are real, is if another self-consciousness recognizes that and I experience that. Right? That's how. Otherwise, all I'm going to be is this endless turning the things of the world into something for me. But I'll never be sure that I'll never have affirmed myself as that unity that's separate from life, as a self-consciousness. So the I, which is the object of its notion, is in fact not object. The object of desire, however, is only independent, for it is the universal indestructible substance, the fluid self-identical essence. A self-consciousness in being an object is just as much I as object. With this, we already have before us the notion of spirit. Oh, and then this is sort of where his whole project's headed, right? So what still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence. I, that is we, and we, that is I. So spirit involves both of those moments, right? On one hand, it's a subtraction. This is my identity. I'm separate, but I find my separateness, I find what I am in relation to a we, in relation to other self-consciousnesses. So it is in self-consciousness, in the notion of spirit, that consciousness first finds its turning point, where it leaves behind in the colourful show of sensuous here and now, and the night-like void of the supersensible beyond, and steps out into the spiritual daylight of the present. In other words, when you so remember Hegel's notion of spirit, it is more like that. Remember, say the idea that mind is like outside of ourselves. It's actually the way in which groups of self-consciousnesses create a rational reality in the world collectively. So in this notion of spirit, then you actually are going to have it both affirms these self-consciousnesses as having some legitimate, independent, autonomous desires, but it affirms it. But that it can only be affirmed because there is a sense of because of those the value of the intersubjective relationships where that's being guaranteed in some way. And so that allows us to, when we accept that, so the idea here, I mean, this is one thing. If you accept that the truth of who you are is actually caught up in the intersubjective relations of your community and so on, then it's not based on anything beyond. It's like not based on something that's unattainable. It's not based on something that's either the transcendent God or something that's deep inside you that no one will ever recognize. It's like no, an unalienated existence, not completely unalienated because there's always going to be self-conscious negativity, but at least a existence where there's a mutual recognition of the legitimacy of autonomy and freedom. That's possible. We don't have to think of that as as something impossible at all. And not only that, I'd obviously say not only is it possible, but Hegel would say it is manifesting, that we're seeing this idea actually play out in history, right? Okay. No. So just some points, some little reflections. So Hegel's conception of self-consciousness, you can see it builds on both the Cartesian and the Kantian gestures of seeing the subject as essentially almost like this empty point of negativity, what Kant called that point of a perception that's posited in the very activity of thinking. So they share that similarity in their conceptions of the subject. And like Kant, Hegel's self-consciousness affirms itself as something that is not just the world. So it's separate from nature. It's a negativity. Like Kant, Hegel's going to say, and this has a real ethical import, right? Because like for Kant, it's wrong to ever treat a subject as a means to an end. Every subject is an end in itself. So Hegel comes up with a very similar idea. Its ultimate expression is something like autonomy and self-determination. And like Kant, the subject shows its freedom by showing how it's determined by something more than just this desire to perpetuate an animal existence. It's moved by this desire for recognition. But how's it different from Kant? Because unlike Kant, this self-consciousness' desire for freedom has not developed from some a priori principles. Hegel's tried to show how that self-consciousness develops from its struggle with the world. So rather than starting with the like in practical reason, starting with the idea of a subject which is aware of and so subject to some sort of self-legislating moral law, Hegel's trying to tell a story to show us how that's, in a way, that picture is correct, but the way in which it develops is from the way that the world is. We don't need to posit any a priori's, and you don't need to separate out the theoretical and the practical, because in this account, the account of the ethical is coming out of a story of what actually is in the world and of how self-consciousness relates to the world and so on. So that's the other thing I find really interesting here, this collapse between, or possible collapse between the theoretical and the practical, which you don't have in Kant. Or at least on a superficial reading of Kant. Okay. I wanted to have, this is me probably being stupid. I wanted to try, like, how would Hegel, what would be a Hegelian response to Cartesian skepticism? Just defined as, the argument, the only belief I can be certain of is that I exist. I think therefore I am. It's a good undergraduate practice of, can you knock down Descartes' argument? Because that's the only thing we can be sure of. So for Hegel, this, first of all, the whole thing of cogito ergo sum, it does reveal something fundamental about self-consciousness. So it reveals that split between self-consciousness as movement and unity. Like it's I thinking, it's a movement, but it's a unity. I am. So that's fine. But I think that Hegel could challenge Descartes just by throwing out these questions. Why are you saying this? What do you desire when you say this? And to whom are you speaking? In the same way that, you can knock down Descartes' argument by appealing to like a Wittgensteinian idea of argument against private language. The very fact that Descartes is talking a language when he makes this claim shows that he must be in an intersubjective community. So the moment you begin to say, okay, I get that you're making that claim, but the moment you ask that question, but why, to whom, how does this claim relate to your project as a self-consciousness? Then all of a sudden you can see that what it's claiming just can't be the case. So you can, I think, claim that there's something like a performative contradiction happening here. Descartes is claiming, I think, therefore I am, and that's the only thing of which I can be certain. But in his very act of affirming that, there must be some desire as to why he's saying it. There must be some intersubjective community to which he's appealing when he's saying it. And if you have those two things, then there's other things that he's positing in saying that other than just his own existence. And I also think that helps, like, I really love the move also that Hegel makes here of just defining self-consciousness as desire, because you don't, because the impression I have of Descartes and Kant is that it's like the I is almost like this, just a logical structure. Whereas in this account, the I is first and foremost a thing that's relating to the world in a really concrete way, like wanting to shape the world, and so on. So that's just some comments, some asides. Okay, lordship of bondage. So I'll talk for, I might just go to 11, then we'll pause then for a bit of a break. So now we move on to this second section of lordship and bondage. And this, of course, is the famous master-slave dialectic, although in the Miller translation, the words master-slave don't appear. So we're going to be calling it lordship bondage. So in this section, you're going, and of course, this is one of the most famous sections of Hegel. Many people who, when we talk about Hegel, this is the section that everyone thinks of, even though it's only a small part of this book. But the reason it's so influential is because I don't know, I'd like to think it's because of its political import. Because the import of this argument, basically, is that freedom has to be a group project. That if you try to assert freedom as just your freedom, that will inevitably undo itself. That's the import of the argument, which is important and profound, I think. Okay, so he starts the section by talking about defining what recognition is. So recognition involves a self-consciousness finding its self-identity in another self-consciousness. So it must supersede itself in relating to the other, and then this supersession itself forms what it is for itself. I am how I relate to the other. And so that's where you get that famous phrase of they recognize themselves as mutually recognizing each other. So the middle term is self-consciousness, which splits into the extremes, and each extreme is this exchanging of its own determinateness and an absolute transition into the opposite. Although as consciousness, it does indeed come out of itself, yet though out of itself, it is at the same time kept back within itself, is for itself, and the self outside it is for it. It is aware that it at once is and is not another consciousness, and equally that this other is for itself, only when it supersedes itself as being for itself, and is for itself only in the being for self of the other. Each is for the other, the middle term, through which each mediates itself with itself and unites with itself, and each is for itself and for the other, an immediate being on its own account, which at the same time is such only through this mediation they recognize themselves as mutually recognizing each other. So you can see that the language there is just that I can see myself as a for itself only if I'm recognizing you as a for itself, and you recognize me as a for itself. And in that mutual recognition, we're able to both. I'm at once affirming you in a way. I'm giving you yes, you're a for itself, and in that very act of affirming you, I'm seeing you as a self-consciousness, and now you can affirm me. That allows me then to be affirmed. So my identity as that self-consciousness is legitimized only when it's recognized, and through being recognized in something other, by another for itself, out of itself. But that recognition, again, is what allows me now. I'm definitely am a for itself. I'm a for itself because I have another for itself that is recognizing me as a for itself. And then we have the famous master-slave dialectic, which I know everyone knows, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. So once upon a time, we have two self-consciousnesses encountering each other. And after this initial encounter, they take each other as just another part of life. So at this initial encounter, they both meet each other, but they are not seeing each other as another self-consciousness yet. It's like they encounter each other and it's like, you're just another object. So you can see person A meets person B. Person A says, hey, you go and hunt something for me. And the other person says, no, I'm not going to hunt something for you. What do you think I am, an object? I want you to hunt something for me. And then the other person says, well, no, you are just an object. I'm the one that matters. I'm the self-conscious. Everything should be related to me. So you are going to hunt for me. And the other one says, no, I'm not going to hunt for you. I'm going to hunt for me because I'm the self-conscious. Everything relates to me. And then, of course, what you're going to have is that they're going to fight. That's the first thing. But this initial shape, the important thing is that what is other for it is an unessential negatively characterized object. So in this initial stage, the other is also a self-consciousness. One individual is confronted by another individual. Appearing as immediately on the scene, they are for one another like ordinary objects, independent shapes, individuals submerged in the being of life. For the object in its immediacy is here determined as life. They are for each other, shapes of consciousness which have not yet accomplished the movement of absolute abstraction, of rooting out all immediate being, and of being merely the purely negative being of self-identical consciousness. In other words, they have not as yet exposed themselves to each other in the form of pure being for self or as self-consciousness. So they're seeing each other as objects at this stage. Now they engage in a life or death struggle. And it's important. The reason that it's important that it has to be almost like to the death is because this is how the self-conscious is going to show itself as a self-consciousness, right? How do I know that this object I'm fighting is another self-consciousness and not just another object? It's that it's willing to die to assert its autonomy. So the thing that's most important to it is its autonomy, is that it's a being for itself, is that it's this thing that desires. And that's more important to it than even having life. If I say to this other, either you will do this for me or I will kill you, they're willing to say, I would rather die. That's how I know that, this isn't just another object in the world. There's something in this object which is like me, wants to actually have projects. It wants to make the world its own. So they must engage in this struggle, for they must raise their certainty of being for themselves to truth, both in the case of the other and their own case, in a way that each of them wants to assert that the world is what I make it, is what I want it to be. And it is only through staking one's life that freedom is won. Only thus is it proved that for self-consciousness, its essential being is not being, the immediate form in which it appears, not its submergence in the expanse of life, but rather there is nothing present in it which could not be regarded as a vanishing moment, that it is only pure being for self. The individual who has not risked his life may well be recognized as a person, but he's not attained to the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. And this reminds me of similar arguments in Critique of Practical Reason, where Kant would say, that he'd say, the example of the scaffold. It's like you say to a man, "There's a woman in there that you would desire, but if you sleep with that woman, the next day you're going to be hanged." It's like the consequence for that would be death. Then most people would go, "Definitely not. I'm not going to do that. Like, it's not worth it. It's just a shallow pleasure, and my life isn't worth it." But if you would take the same person and say to them, you need to lie about your friend to save yourself. Lie to the king. The king wants to kill this person. We need your false testimony. Say the false testimony, and your life will be saved. Then we can definitely imagine people going, "No, that's not worth it," right? So the point being that in human beings, there seems to be this thing that we're not just worried about our desires and our pleasures and being happy in a bodily sense, comfortable in a bodily sense. We strive for something else. So in Hegel here, this something else is just this ability to be this self-consciousness that's not just reducible to the natural world. But one of these self-consciousnesses chickens out. So one of the self-consciousness goes, no, you know what? It's not worth it. I don't want to die. Fine. I'll do whatever you tell me to. And then they split into the two. So they split into two unequal things. You have the Lord and you have the bondsman. So one is the independent consciousness whose essential nature is to be for itself, the Lord, and the other is the dependent consciousness whose essential nature is simply to live and to be for another. They're now the bondsman. And on the surface, it looks like the Lord has won because the Lord now has recognition. The Lord's got their recognition. The meaning of two self-consciousness is the Lord's been able to say, you go do this for me. And the other person said, fine, I will. I'll just be an object for you. I'll go and hunt for you. I'll do whatever you say. And and the Lord gets to sit back and just have fun, enjoy themselves and go, this is great. Another object in the world that I've bent to my will in affirming my existence. Fantastic. So how goes wrong? So at first, the Lord thinks he's recognized. He sees that the bondsman is constrained in their subjugation to submit to their desire. And the bondsman completely sets aside their being for self of the Lord. And what the bondsman does is just an extension of the Lord's desire. That's all good. But as the slave is now reduced to not just another object, the truth of the Lord-bondsman relationship is that the Lord cannot be properly recognized. So in this recognition, and this is the passage. So in this recognition, the unessential consciousness is for the Lord the object, which constitutes the truth of his certainty of himself. But it is clear that this object does not correspond to its notion, but rather the object in which the Lord has achieved his lordship has in reality turned out to be something quite different from an independent consciousness. What now really confronts him is not an independent consciousness, but a dependent one. He is therefore not certain of being for self as the truth of himself. On the contrary, his truth is in reality the unessential consciousness and its unessential action. In short, in reducing the bondsman to a slave or to someone who's merely following out his desires, the bondsman does become just another object in the world, and then that slave the bondsman cannot recognize the Lord in a way the Lord would find satisfying. So the Lord thinks that by defeating the other, he's achieved self-recognition. He's achieved the recognition he's after, but in fact, he hasn't. The only way he can get recognition is if someone is freely giving him this recognition, which you can't do if you're in a Lord bondsman relationship. So look, I think one of the plays of Shakespeare that really illustrates this point is King Lear. I'm going to talk about this for a little while. So King Lear famously performs a love test for his three daughters in response for them being able to, he's going to divide up his kingdom into three. And the love test is basically, each of you are going to tell me how much you love me, and based on that, I'll decide I'll decide on how big a piece of land you get. And Goneril and Regan speak first, and they falsely and ostentatiously say how much they love King Lear in a really over-the-top way, which is obviously sycophantic and false. But King Lear loves it. He's like, fantastic, you get some land. But the daughter who really loves him refuses to speak. And although she doesn't say as much, you get the sense that participating in this spectacle would actually mean she doesn't really love her father. That because she truly loves her father, she can't express it in a way where she is just an object, which is exactly what Cordelia and Regan have done, right? It's like, you're my subject, tell me how much you love me. They say it, and King Lear sees that, he enjoys that, he sees it as a legitimate recognition. But of course, Goneril and Regan don't care about King Lear at all. The one who really does care about him refuses to do that, because if she's going to say that she loves him and it's just out of this sycophantic order that she's doing it, that's not how you express love. Love has to be freely given. And of course, where the story, King Lear then learns that Goneril and Regan's love was in fact false. He's just an object to them. In saying that, he was treating them as an object, but they've treated him as an object as well, because they were just doing it to get the land they wanted. And King Lear loses his mind when he realizes that he's actually not a king. So he just assumed a king was something he really was, so that when he gave away his crown and his daughters took over, they would still treat him as a king, because he's King Lear. But what, of course, he learns is, no, you actually only have that identity. That identity relied the whole time on intersubjectivity. It wasn't something that you actually were. And that sends him insane, of course, because he doesn't know then what he is. But he finds his identity again in his love for Cordelia and vice versa. So the key thing here, we'll pause here for 10 minutes or so, is just that if you, to have, for recognition to be legitimate, it's almost like it has to be freely given. And if it's forced, then it's not real recognition. The other, if it's forced, then the other is just another object. And you go back to the same problem where you're not encountering anything in the world that is allowing you to have some determined identity in terms of this is what I want, and that is who I am, and that's legitimate. Yeah. Okay. We'll pause there and we'll come back at 11:10. Okay, let's keep going. So now we come. So we've seen why the truth for the Lord thought that they were getting recognition, but it turns out that in their very act of getting their recognition, they find that they actually don't get the recognition that they're after, or that they thought they were getting by turning this other self-consciousness into a servant, a bondsman. Now we come and look at the bondsman. What is the truth of the bondsman? So again, it looks like at first that the bondsman is not going to, that it's just become this object, but it actually, through the process of being turned into a bondsman, it gets transformed into a truly independent consciousness. So again, it becomes the opposite to what it appeared to be at first. So let's look at how this happens. So first, by serving the Lord, the bondsman achieves some sense of independence. First of all, the bondsman has experienced the threat of death, and so has experienced his own negation. And Hegel says here that the absolute melting away of everything stable to reveal the essential nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure being for itself. And this is an important part of the bondsman's experience. The idea seems to be here that in having this experience, this near-death experience, in its struggle with the Lord, it's encountered that this possibility of almost like this absolute melting of, so the absolute negation of everything in the world. This and so that that near-death experience has made it realize, or almost like encounter itself as just this pure negativity, this pure being for itself. That isn't actually anything that is reducible to life in the world or what's in the world. Second step, through working through the Lord, the bondsman rids himself of his attachment to natural existence in every single detail. So because now this self-consciousness of the slave isn't doing things for themselves, not just doing whatever they want, they're rather forced to do things they don't want to do for another self-consciousness. In doing so, they're now, they learn discipline. And they're able to do things in the world, and through that, though, they learn that they actually have this autonomous agency. They actually have some agency in the world. They can affect the world. But this effect is not by, as it would be if they're a lord, just by doing whatever they want and getting whatever they want. It's rather one that has to be achieved through discipline. They're not doing whatever they want. So they're getting up in the morning, they're going out and they're plowing the field to make food for the Lord. And this repetitive activity shows them that they can actually have, teach them self-control, control over themselves. And so that they become aware of themselves as this autonomous being that actually can shape the world in a way that means that they're not just going to be following through or listening to like natural inclinations. So this negative middle term, or the formative activity, is at the same time the individuality or pure being for self of consciousness, which now in the work outside of it acquires an element of permanence. It is in this way, therefore, the consciousness, insofar as it's a worker, comes to see in the independent being of the object its own independence. So by now denying itself, by learning discipline, by filling out the desires of someone else, it nevertheless comes to experience how through this disciplined activity, it can actually achieve things in the world. It does have this, this capacity for forming things in the objective world. And it shows its independence because it's able to do that by denying what, in a way, just following along what it just wants to do, whatever its natural self would say it should do. Lastly, the bondsman has been motivated to work by fear, and in working for this reason, the bondsman is able to put aside the individual desires. And this is why Hegel emphasizes that this fear is actually really important, because it's only It's only if they've had that fear that they're able to see themselves as this for itself that is almost even negated from, I don't want to say like their natural inclinations, like this, that even if it got rid of all its pathological desires and so on, it would still persist as this for itself that is just there. So it's almost like through that fear, it encounters the truth of what it is, this pure negativity, this pure for itself that can't be reducible to anything to anything else. Okay. So the next three, so that's the end. So, but through that, then the bondsman actually then comes to affirm its autonomy, because it's able to see. It realizes through its experiences like this bondsman, it realizes it's this for itself that is almost like this pure negativity that is not reducible to anything in the world. And it also learns, though, through its discipline, it learns its capacity to work in the world, to change the world, that it has, and then through that, in some sense of independence and some autonomy. Ones that the Lord doesn't have, because the Lord has never had to, well, the Lord is still at the stage where the world is just bending itself to the Lord's will. Now, obviously, ideally, the master-slave dialectic would be resolved by some sense of mutual recognition. But before we get there, Hegel now takes us to really three ways of thinking that tries to keep the self-consciousness without going towards the mutual recognition, without recognizing the legitimacy of the master-slave relationship. So I see these three ways of thinking about the world are ways of trying to save your self-consciousness and without having to admit that no, the way in which you relate to others in the world is actually who you are. That I can ignore that I can separate myself from that. Okay, so let's go through them. This is the three movements as I've sketched them out. So the three movements he goes through in this last section are Stoicism, Skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. So Stoicism is the belief that you can achieve well-being by attuning yourselves to the rational order of the universe. And it involves a type of thinking. So you sort of retreat into this idea of, I'm going to live according to reason, this principle, and I become indifferent to the circumstances of my reality. The problem with this philosophy for Hegel is that it just ignores the actual concrete details of life. The project fails because it just turns into a series of fairly abstract platitudes. So then the consciousness says, okay, well, rationalism doesn't work. I'm just going to be skeptical of everything. I'm not going to admit the reality of anything. I'm a thinking thing, and I can just continually think by denying that I should believe anything. That fails because of performative contradictions, as we'll see. That then leads into the unhappy consciousness, where the consciousness is split between a finite changeable, it splits itself between a finite changeable world of appearance and a transcendent infinite rational order that governs the universe. Or another way of thinking about it is that after skepticism, the consciousness says, you're right, like I am this thing that thinks, this ability, so this thing that does connect with something unchangeable and essential. But I'm also this finite person stuck in a particular situation, and I want to, and it tries to identify with this unchangeable nature, and it just finds that it can't. And it finds itself perpetually alienated. Okay, let's go through each of them. So, Stoicism. Now, although it's brought about, you could read this as coming about from the inside of the slave, right? It's like the slave comes to see, look, I can achieve things in the world through hard work. And so so rather than seeing myself as limited by this world where I'm just following this Lord's, this Lord's orders, I can think to myself, I am a for itself that can exist independently of the world. I can find my freedom here. I can, in a way, live in such a way that the reality of the which I mediated is not going to be relevant to me anymore. So this is how Hegel describes his consciousness. We're in the presence of a self-consciousness in a new shape, a consciousness which, as the infinitude of consciousness or as its own pure movement, is aware of itself as essential being, a being which thinks or is a free self-consciousness. For to think does not mean to be an abstract I, but an I which has at the same time the significance of intrinsic being, of having itself for object, or of relating to itself to objective being in such a way that its significance is the being for self of the consciousness for which it is an object. So you can see in Stoicism, it's aware of itself as a thinking thing, and it says, well, even though I may not be free in the circumstances of my life, I can be free insofar as I follow these principles of reason, insofar as I can use reason to reflect upon my situation and through thinking itself achieve some type of freedom from in the world. So Stoicism's principle is that consciousness is a being that thinks, and that consciousness holds something to be essentially important or true or good only insofar as it thinks it as such. And of course, it has this negative attitude towards the Lord-Bondsman relationship. So its aim is to be free and to maintain that lifeless indifference which steadfastly withdraws from the bustle of existence, alike from being active as passive into the simple essentiality of thought. Self-will is a freedom which entrenches itself in some particularity and is still in bondage, while Stoicism is a freedom which always comes directly out of bondage and returns into the pure universality of thought. So what's wrong with Stoicism? Well, on the surface, Hegel would sort of agree with that basic Stoic allegiance to the principle of reason as having an important function to play in guiding how we should live in the world, but it ignores the actual concrete historical reality of the subject, and it pretends as if that's not relevant. That what's important is that you have access to that rationality, and then use that rationality as the guiding principles for your life. And if you do that, the actual historical concrete situations won't matter, but they're not important. And that's where Stoicism gets it wrong. And what Hegel says here is that it actually relies then on a completely empty idea of freedom. That freedom just does not mean being someone's slave, but nevertheless being able to reason, well, that's just the way the world is. That's the rational order of the world. I'm just going to accept it. That's not a genuine idea of freedom. That's an empty idea of freedom, because it's only a freedom in thought, and it's one that ignores the aspect of the concrete existence. So as he said there, it's freedom in thought has only pure thought as its truth. It's just lacking in the fullness of life. So you actually don't get genuine freedom through Stoicism. And because I know Stoicism is really popular. Like if you go to, and I often wonder why. And I think one of the reasons why Stoicism is popular is just because it does, Hegel's point is it does lead to these really empty platitudes that sound wise, and they sound like they apply to everyone, but really they're just empty, right? So, I mean, like a principle of Stoicism, let's say a piece of wisdom is, don't try to change things you can't change, right? Or do the rational thing, do what's rational. Don't let yourself be guided by emotions. But then you actually have a concrete decision you need to make. Should I marry this woman or shouldn't I? Well, what would reason say? It's like, not a lot. I don't know. Can you give me something more? It's like, well, don't let yourself be guided by negative emotions. Control your emotions. It's like, yeah, okay, I feel like I'm controlling my emotions. Like, but I just need to know, and you need to answer my question for me. And the point is, like, a lot of these platitudes, they actually don't give you any content to really guide really important decisions in life. For those, you actually did need some concrete analysis. And so it becomes empty. Zizek makes the point that, he does it. There's an interview once, and he goes, I hate wisdom. And the person said, what do you mean you hate wisdom? And he goes, you give me a wise saying, and I can just turn it into its opposite. It sounds just as wise. It's empty. We sort of talking about this sort of thing. And I think the example is like the word, if someone says to me, oh, the universe is empty, it's just nothing, there's nothing there. So and so in the massive expanse of the universe. So don't worry about that. Just live for the moment and just enjoy yourself. It's like, okay, well, that works. But then again, you can just sort of assert the opposite and go, oh, the universe is there, but it's absolutely amazing. It's majestical. It's a miracle, and everything is so inexplicable. And therefore, you should just enjoy life enjoy life for the moment. Or it can just lead to the opposite. It's like the universe is there, it's inexplicable, and because it's nothing, therefore there's no point to anything. And so you should just, just end your life. So it's like the end, this empty, just this empty wisdom that is so general and so vague, it doesn't actually really talk to the concrete conditions of our existence. Yeah. So that's what he says there. What is good and true gave for an answer the contentless thought. The true and the good shall consist in reasonableness, but the self-identity of thought is again only the pure form in which nothing is determined. The true and the good, wisdom and virtue, the general terms beyond which Stoicism cannot get, are therefore in a general way no doubt uplifting, but since they cannot in fact produce any expansion of the content, they soon become tedious. So then the consciousness says, okay, well, appealing to reason doesn't work. How about I just don't believe in anything? I'm going to be a skeptic. So I just, ignore the external world, I ignore reason, and I'm just going to question everything all the time. And this is what I am now. I'm now this person who I don't assert anything. So now that you have a form of thinking or consciousness that becomes wholly unessential and, which just wants to, no matter what I'm thinking, I'm going to say that that I think something otherwise. And I'm just going to doubt everything that's put in front of me. I'm going to doubt other self-consciousnesses. I could doubt the existence and just be this practice of thinking that's almost like constantly annihilating its own thinking. So in skepticism now, the wholly unessential and non-independent character of the other becomes explicit for consciousness. The thought becomes the concrete thinking which annihilates the being of the world in all its manifold determinateness, denies the world is there, and the negativity of free self-consciousness comes to know itself in the many and varied forms of life as real negativity. And so it asserts it's free of self-consciousness by just saying, I don't have to believe anything. I can just doubt everything. The contradiction in skepticism, though, is that it just can't do it. Like, you can't do it. Skepticism cannot bring together the performance of its skepticism with the content of its skepticism. So in declaring something to be false, it expresses certainty. So just as an example of that, if you're a skeptical, one of Hegel's points here is that you just can't live as a skeptical person. Like no one can actually have a concrete existence where you're constantly going out in the world and just denying the existence of everything. Because you are a concrete individual, you are in a real world, and you do believe things, even if you want to, in your self-consciousness, you want to explicitly deny them. Come back to if someone comes, comes to you and says, there's, or they say like I don't. If you're having a conversation with a really skeptical person, and they're talking to you and they're going, you know what? I don't believe anything. I don't even believe you exist. And it's like, straight away, go, well, then why are you talking to me? Like, surely if you don't believe I exist, the conversation ends, right? Or if someone's going to say, they're talking to you and they go, you know what? I can't even be sure you're a real consciousness, self-consciousness. Maybe you're just a zombie. So again, why are you talking to a zombie? You wouldn't talk to a zombie. So in the very act of stating their skepticism, they're also portraying a belief in something opposite. In the activity of skepticism, of going out and thinking these thoughts, you're still relying on all these things, the existence of language, which involves the existence of a community. You're still relying on the concrete world all the time, because what you're denying is things that you're seeing and perceiving and interacting with in the concrete world. So skepticism is just always caught up in its activity. It wants to be denying. But every time it tries to make a skeptical claim, it's still in some way affirming something, and it just can't avoid that. It's a performative contradiction. Yes. And that's his quote from there. So this consciousness is therefore the unconscious, thoughtless rambling, which passes back and forth from the one extreme of self-identical self-consciousness to the other extreme of the contingent consciousness that is both bewildered and bewildering. It does not itself bring these two thoughts of itself together. At one time, it recognizes that its freedom lies in rising above all the confusion and contingency of existence. And at another time, equally admits to a relapse into occupying itself with what is unessential. It lets the unessential content in its thinking vanish, but just in doing so, it is the consciousness of something unessential. It pronounces an absolute vanishing, but the pronouncement is, and this consciousness is the vanishing that is pronounced. It affirms the nullity of seeing and hearing, etc., yet it is itself seeing, hearing, etc. It affirms the nullity of ethical principles and lets its conduct be governed by these very principles. Its deeds and its words always belie one another, and equally it has itself the doubly contradictory consciousness of unchangeableness and sameness and of utter contingency and non-identity with itself. Okay, so then we have the unhappy consciousness. And this unhappy consciousness is then the new form which accepts this dual nature. That on the one hand, it's this self-liberating, unchangeable, self-identical ability to think, to withdraw from the finite world, and on the other hand, a self-bewildering, self-perverting, finite self, and that these two things just can't go together. So whereas Stoicism and skepticism attempt to retreat from the concrete world and say that I can find freedom in a way of thinking where I just deny the reality of the world. In Stoicism, it's live according to a principle of reason, which will help me navigate this finite world, and so avoid its pitfalls. Or at least I still have me freedom, despite the fact that I'm changed here. In the unhappy consciousness, it affirms it sees itself as both. It is this finite, temporal, changeable, protean is an adjective there somewhere, being, but it also has this connection to something unchangeable, something infinite, something transcendent. And it's now torn between these two, and it wants to bring the two together, but it can't. And so it wants to align itself. The unhappy consciousness wants to align itself with this unchangeable nature. It sees this unchangeable nature as what it really is, but it can't do it. It can't get there. And so you can sort of read this, and we'll see at the moment there really is a Christian lens on this section on the unhappy consciousness, and in the way that it works through. So I think a simple way in is just to see this as the Christian ideal, that I have an immortal soul that relates me to something unchangeable and infinite, but on the other hand, I'm a corrupted, finite, mortal person who is not able to access that unchangeable because I have this other aspect of myself. But what I am is both these things together. Yes. So, section 208, since it is to begin with only the immediate unity of the two, and so takes them to be not the same but opposites, one of them, the simple unchangeable, it takes to be the essential being, but the other, the protean changeable, it takes to be the unessential. The two are, for the unhappy consciousness, alien to one another, and because it is itself the consciousness of this contradiction, it identifies itself with a changeable consciousness and takes itself to be the unessential being. But, so you can see there it identifies, okay, there's this unchangeable being, which is essential, and then there's this protean changeable being, and I really should be this unchangeable being. That's what I should be. That's really my true essence. But in fact, what I am is this finite, corrupt, changeable thing. But so the key point there is it sees the unchangeable as actually what is essential, and it comes to see the concrete world as inessential. That's not where the truth of where I'm going to find rest in terms of what I am. But as consciousness of changeableness or of simple essential being, it must at the same time set about freeing itself from the unessential, from itself. For though it indeed takes itself to be merely the changeable, and the unchangeable is for an alien being, yet it is itself a simple, hence unchangeable consciousness, and hence is aware that this consciousness is its own essence, although in such a way that, again, it does not itself take that essence to be its own. So the unhappy consciousness, as I said, it takes this unchangeable nature to be its true self, and so then the changeable nature becomes something that constantly frustrates its desire to find its true, to become this unchangeable being. So here you have the consciousness really alienated from itself. So in the Christian context, it would be the person thinking, I need to be like God. I need to find my identity in my relation to God. In that relation, I would be unchangeable, perfect, something stable, something that is almost like just that doesn't, which has its finds a resting place. But what I find is that I'm actually this changeable thing where my desires and my thoughts and they're actually always changing, and I can't stay stable. So in wanting to identify with the unchangeable, I end up feeling like what I am is not what I am. I really want to be this central part of myself, but I'm constantly frustrated by this unchangeable thing. And that's the first way in which this consciousness contradicts itself, right? Because even if it was successful, even if this consciousness was able to transform itself into the unchangeable, that itself would be a change. And so it would still be showing that it's this changeable thing. Even if it succeeds, it would have had one time not to be the unchangeable, in which case it's still changed. And so it's not the unchangeable. Yes. So here then we have a struggle against an enemy, to vanquish whom is really to suffer defeat, where victory in one consciousness is really lost in its opposite. In other words, the victory of achieving the unchangeable would still be a defeat because it would still show unchanging. Consciousness of life, of its existence and activity, is only an agonizing over this existence and activity, and therein it is conscious, and its essence is only its opposite, is conscious only of its own nothingness. That's just making the point that as consciousness in life is going to involve change no matter what. So raising itself out of this consciousness, it goes over into the unchangeable. But this elevation is itself this same consciousness. It is therefore directly conscious of the opposite, viz. Of itself as a particular individual. The unchangeable that enters into consciousness is through this very fact at the same time affected by individuality, and is only present with the latter. Individuality, instead of having been extinguished in the consciousness of the unchangeable, only continues to arise therefrom. Hegel then describes in section 210 three different ways in which individuality can be linked to the unchangeable. And this is basically the Trinity, right? So, I can imagine the unchangeable as the God, the Father. So this is the alien God who passes judgment on me, who is just external to me. Or second, I can find my individuality itself as part of the unchangeable. So here the individuality is, it's where my unchangeableness is something that is rooted in, it's like it's incarnated. So that I myself have contained this thing that is unchangeable, which calls me to be something other than what I am. And of course, that's the incarnation, the idea that God became man. And then third, you have the Holy Spirit. So it finds itself and this particular individual in the unchangeable. So this relation to the unchangeable is, if you imagine, you know how like our God is everywhere? Like I'm an individual that's subsumed in everything, and that everything is the unchangeable. Like that is the reconciliation of individuality with the universal. So almost like finding myself at one with this being that's unchangeable. So, and then Hegel sort of steps through some of the idea of incarnation and so on, and says that even though there's a partial reconciliation with between the finite and the infinite and the incarnation, like it looks like that idea partly resolves this difficulty, because it says, look, it is possible for the finite individual to become one with the unchangeable. In fact, it doesn't quite work, because that the conception of that reconciliation still relies on an other in the figure of Christ, and even though it shows a possibility of a union, it doesn't really mean, it sort of emphasizes how impossible it is for me to have that union, because I'm nowhere near like Jesus, right? So it's just like, it's not really possible. And then he moves into, with each of those three areas, he talks about one way of three ideals of religious practice where the unhappy consciousness tries to overcome its self-alienation and so identify with the unchangeable. So these three ideals are prayer, work, and penitence, or devotion, work, and penitence. The first one would be reacting to God as the alien. The second one is when I act to God as being the possibility of God being embodied in my own actions in the world, in the concrete, my concrete individuality. And then my third one would be reality in terms of how I am finding my freedom in the universe as such, in totality. Okay, so the prayer is the first one. I treat God as an alien other. And so this is an attempt to reconcile myself with the unchangeable through thought. So I pray to God. I say, I'm nothing. I'm hopeless. You're wonderful. You're amazing. Sing songs to God. Maybe raise my hands and so on. And through this, I'm going to relate to the other. So in this first mode, therefore, where we consider it as pure consciousness, it does not relate itself as a thinking consciousness to its object. But though it is indeed in itself or implicitly a pure thinking individuality, and its object is just as pure thinking, although the relation of one to the other is not itself pure thinking, it is only a movement towards thinking, and so is devotion. Its thinking as such is no more than the chaotic jingling of bells or a mist of warm incense, a musical thinking that does not get as far as the notion, which would be the sole immanent objective mode of thought. This infinite pure inner feeling does indeed come into possession of its object, but this does not make its appearance in conceptual form, not as something comprehended and appears as something alien. So he seems to imply here that through prayer and devotion, I can get this sense that I'm accessing the God as a feeling, or God as a sense of, I'm relating to this alien other, and in a way that allows me to affirm them or praise them or show my devotion to them. But really, what it's not doing is you can't translate that into a concept. So you're not really understanding it. You're not, and in that sense, you're not getting closer to the unchangeable. And of course, in the very action of devotion, what you're actually doing is, so on the surface, devotion and prayer, what it looks like I'm doing is gaining access to the unchangeable. But if the fact that I have to do it again and again and again just shows the impossibility of it. It shows my failure. And in the same way that if you had a partner and if you had a partner and one morning they wake up and they start telling you, that they love you. It's like, I love you. It's like, yeah, sure, I love you too. And then at lunchtime, it's like, I really love you. It's like, yeah, okay, I love you. And then by the dinner time, they're saying it again, I love you. I love you, right? Then straight away you're thinking, why are you saying this so much? What's going on? Why do you think that there's something wrong with our relationship that you have to say this over and over again? So the very fact, the activity of constantly praying, of desperately seeking to connect to God, is at the same time it just shows that it's actually a failure. That the very action shows, and the more you pray, the more you're devoted, the more that the God just becomes apparent as something unchangeable and beyond that you can't access, right? So what we have here then is the inward movement of the pure heart, which feels itself, but itself as agonizingly self-divided, the movement of an infinite yearning, which is certain that its essence is such a pure heart, a pure thinking, which thinks of itself as a particular individuality, certain of being known and recognized by this object, precisely because the latter thinks of itself as an individuality. So it feels great connection with this unchangeable that it's praying to. At the same time, however, this essence is the unattainable beyond, which, in being laid hold of, flees, or rather has already flown. It has already flown, for it is in part the unchangeable, which thinks of itself as an individuality, and consciousness therefore directly attains in it its own self, but as the antithesis of the unchangeable. Instead of laying hold of the essence, it only feels it and has fallen back into itself. Since in attaining itself, consciousness is unable to get away from itself, as this antithesis to the unchangeable, it has, instead of laying hold of essence, only laid hold of what is unessential. In other words, I thought I was getting a hold of God, but what I'm actually getting a hold of is just the failure of my consciousness to get to God over and over again. The action defeats the intention. I set out to, it's just a great example of dialectical analysis, right? I set out to do something to get close to God. And I think if I do this prayer and this devotion, I'm going to achieve access to the unchangeable. And so that's my intention. But in the very act of performing this prayer and this devotion, I do the opposite. I make it apparent to myself through my action that that unchangeable is actually completely inaccessible. So the action reveals the truth of the action reveals to me the truth of what my intention was, the truth of what prayer and devotion is. And you can see that there's also a good example of dialectic, because you can only realize that. The only way you realize the failure of that prayer and that devotion is if you actually do it. So the truth of it is only discovered in the acting out of it. That's when this contradiction reveals itself. Okay, let's keep going. Second way, so you do the incarnated version. So in this version, look, forget about prayer, forget about devotion. I'm not going to spend hours in church. Instead, I'm going to devote my concrete, desiring, active work life to God. So I'm now going to say, through my historical concrete activity, maybe it's planting crops, maybe it's raising a barn. So I'm reading the Crucible at the moment, and so I just think of Puritan society, making a barn, making a church, and then so on. So that's the sort of activity I think of. Like these people, it's like, I'm going to show my faithfulness to God through my actual activity. So then you have this second relationship where desire and work become my way, in which I'm going to overcome the alienation of existence. So the problem with this, first of all, the problem with it is that, but the unhappy consciousness work now is involved in this concrete, finite world, but it's the inessential world. So this, no matter what it does in the world, it's always going to feel that what I'm doing is the inessential. What I'm doing is not as significant as the essential, which is this God of beyond, the unchangeable. And also, although I'm aware of my capacity for labor and how this can shape my own existence, I also come to see that, but again, this inessential work has its basis in something essential. So if I do this amazing thing with my Puritan community of making this barn, it's only by the grace of God we made that barn. It's only God's working through us that we're able to make the barn. So in fact, it's not my barn. It's a barn that expresses unchangeable. So again, nothing in the inessential world is ever going to measure up to that. So this means that work at once makes the unhappy consciousness feel it's doing its God-determined duty, and so is in some sense in union with the unchangeable, but it also makes it alienated from its work because the work is not its own. Lastly, in actually acting in the world, this figure is sort of going to develop this implicit valuing of the concrete finite world. So in making the barn, the figure will actually come to enjoy working with wood. They'll enjoy the power they have through their discipline of acting on the world. And if they're enjoying that, then again, that's the inessential nature that they're enjoying and that they're valuing. And that's pulling them away from what they should be going towards, and that's the unchangeable and the essential. So section 222. So the fact that the unchangeable consciousness renounces and surrenders its embodied form, while on the other hand, the particular individual consciousness gives thanks, denies itself the satisfaction of being conscious of its independence, and assigns the essence of its action, not to itself, but to the beyond. Through these two moments of reciprocal self-surrender of both parts, consciousness does, of course, gain a sense of its unity with the unchangeable. So on one hand, surrendering, giving thanks to the other, it does get some sense of, I am at one with God here doing this work. But this unity is at the same time affected with division, is again broken within itself, and from it there emerges once more the antithesis of the universal and the individual. For though consciousness renounces the show of satisfying its feeling of self, it obtains the actual satisfaction of it, for it has been desire, work, and enjoyment. As consciousness, it has willed, acted, and enjoyed. So you see that the point there that in doing the work, it has actually engaged and enjoyed and been this finite self. And in doing so, it's shown how it's still separate from that unchangeable. And similarly, even in its giving of thanks, in which it acknowledges the other extreme as the essential being and counts itself nothing, it is its own act which counterbalances the action of the extreme and meets self-sacrificing benefits with, beneficence with a like action. So even in giving thanks to God and saying, God, without you, we never would have been able to build we've never been able to build the barn. Even in doing that, its own act of actually making the barn counterbalances that to the other extreme. So that one doesn't work. We got one more, and that's penitence. So this is the one where the unhappy consciousness renounces like bodily pleasures and realities to join with the universal. But of course here, we know from psychoanalysis, this isn't going to work. The more the body is repressed, the more the reality of the body makes itself felt. The more the unhappy consciousness attempts to purge itself of its fallen material reality, the more it becomes a self-centered, wretched, and impoverished. Yes. The example, this is a fairly straightforward one. And again, it's a good example of the dialectic at work. The person who says, well, I'm going to say get rid of any thoughts of sexual desire by whipping myself, and then they come to whip themselves. The whipping itself can then take on almost like can itself become a form of like sexual feeling, right? So this very act of denying your body and trying to to come in connection with the unchangeable actually makes that finite bodily reality all the more all the more obvious, apparent, important. So it does the opposite of what it is intending to do. So consciousness is aware of itself in this actual animal and the animal functions. These are no longer performed naturally without embarrassment as matters of trifling in themselves, which cannot possess any importance or essential significance for spirit. Instead, since it is in them that the enemy reveals himself in his characteristic shape, that is the inessential, they are rather the object of serious endeavor and become precisely matters of the utmost importance. This enemy, however, renews himself in his defeat. So every time you beat these natural inclinations, they come back even stronger. In fixing his attention on him, far from freeing itself from him, really remains forever in contact with him and forever sees itself as defiled. And since at the same time this object of its efforts, instead of being something essential, is of the meanest character, instead of being a universal, is the most particular, we have here only a personality confined to its own self and its own petty actions, a personality brooding over itself, as wretched as it is impoverished. So then we come to the resolution, and I'm going to attempt, I've got my interpretation of how on earth the mediator gets you to reason. I'm not sure it is convincing, and I'm sure that there are other accounts. I find it very obscure. So the unhappy consciousness, although it cannot free itself from its finite corrupt body, still finds in acts of penitence mediation with the unchangeable. So while the penitent's relation to their finite self is negative, that very negativity expresses some sort of positive mediation with the unchangeable. The way I'm reading that is that the very fact that the mortal creature shows that it's willing to almost like torture itself to have access to this unchangeable shows that there is that there's something in that there is still some access to the unchangeable. There is the unchangeable in this in this unhappy consciousness. And the way that then gets expressed positively is through what Hegel calls a mediator. And he also refers to it as a minister or a priest. And in this mediation, then the consciousness frees itself from action and enjoyment, so far as they're regarded as its own. As a separate independent extreme, it rejects the essence of its will and casts upon the mediator or minister its own freedom of decision and herewith the responsibility for its own action. The mediator, having a direct relationship with the unchangeable being, ministers by giving advice on what is right. The action, since it follows upon the decision of someone else, ceases as regards the doing or the willing of it to be its own. And so in the mediator, the idea is that rather than trying to struggle myself with how to achieve the unchangeable, the mediator says, just renounce your freedom, give me all your autonomy, and I'll just tell you what to do. And then through me, I'll worry about the unchangeable. You just do what I tell you to, and you'll be okay. So the unhappy consciousness now gives over its autonomy and all its worldly belongings. It no longer has to take responsibility for its own actions. And when it does that, it no longer has to worry about the fact that it's not encountering the unchangeable, because that's not its job. That's the job of the mediator. The mediator is going to be accessing the unchangeable. All I have to do is what the mediator tells me to do. So all my failures to access the unchangeable I now pretend they're not really problems, because I'm not the one who has to access the unchangeable. The mediator is, and I just relate to the mediator, and the mediator just tells me things to do, and I do them. So now all those things that I'm doing, which felt like failures before, they're not going to feel like failures anymore. I'm not going to maybe experience the unchangeable through them, but that's okay. I'm not accessing the unchangeable anymore. The mediator is. So I can do all these actions now: prayer, work, devotion, as just things that one does, not things that I have to do because I'm trying to resolve my alienation. So this seems to get rid of that problem of alienation. In a way, I outsource the alienation to the mediator. Yeah. So through this, the mediator brings the idea that it's possible to act and live in a world in a way that does satisfy the unchangeable. So do you see what happens? The mediator comes in and says, everyone just do this. And all of a sudden, everyone can just act in the world in a way that means they're not worried about the fact they're not accessing the unchangeable. And when that happens, then you have it's almost like the possibility of an unalienating existence that's concrete and finite manifests in the world. So then through the mediator, that outsourcing of the access to the unchangeable brings the idea that it is possible to act and live in the world in a way that does satisfy the unchangeable. So maybe my particularity is not a conflict with reality. And when individuals no longer see their individuality a conflict of reality, that gets you to reason. Because what is reason for Hegel? So this is the last passage of this section. But in this object, in which it finds that its own action and being as being that of this particular consciousness are being in action in themselves, there has arisen for consciousness the idea of reason, of the certainty that in its particular individuality, it has being absolutely in itself, or is all of reality. In other words, it no longer has to appeal to something unchangeable, or something outside of itself to it can see it's no longer going to be alienated from the world. It's going to see that its consciousness and what's in the world are not different things. That's my account of how the mediator gets there anyway. Yeah. Okay. Next week we move on to observing reason, as I'm calling it. So I'm going to do reason in two sections, one on observing reason and then on active reason, which will be our last session. And that's everything. And ending the stream.